but I believe that Zionism is the intent to the plan to rebuild the Third Temple under one ecumenical religion, and that Judaism would be co-opted, and is co-opted through the likes of the Catholic Knight, Abe Foxman, and the other. They're no longer Jews of the Bible.
Well, I have said that the Zionists here, the bankers, the Rothschild here, the Rockefellers, they hide behind or underneath the Jewish people. So it provides them with a cover. It provides them with pretty much willing slaves, right, doesn't it? And what about the whole term Judeo-Christianity? Seems to be kind of an oxymoron, isn't it?
Well, within the last 8 months, I've come to the realization that there's a much bigger story involved, and it's really anti-human, and that I believe there were prior civilizations. I don't believe that the world existed for only 6,000 years, or however many that the supposed number is that is being pumped out, but that there were prior civilizations that got wiped away every 12,000 years, and it's spoken of in the Bible in regards to Noah, or in Genesis, and that anything that comes out into the public as a general pronouncement has got to be absolutely reverse of what it's being said. You can almost take that to the bank. Whatever they're saying, reverse it. It might be true, and that the government is so out of control, that people are so over-the-top liars that you can't invest in anything they're saying without losing your existence. So I would say that Judaism is Catholicism because of its promise with the Roman families to rebuild the temple as long as everybody towed the line to ecumenism.
Now, isn't that temple basically already rebuilt right in that area?
Well, the Obama and Soros being a Catholic, he's not Jewish. Soros, his name was Schwartz, and he converted to Catholicism in Hungary, so that he was definitely not a Jew, but he is a Catholic Zionist who wants to carry out the plans, and it's already funded. The temple is funded. The only problem is the Al-Aqsa Mosque has not been leveled. They've got to level the mosque first, and as soon as that's done, they can rebuild the temple. Now, the story is that the temple was someplace else, but the consensus is where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is, and we've been sucker punched to go in there. We have bases there. The United States has bases inside of Israel, one that I know of, and that we are going to be blamed with the various strikes to take down the Al-Aqsa Mosque, just like we're going to be blamed for the nuclear attacks on Mecca and Medina. That's already been in the works. I wrote that up and put that in my complaint back in March of last year, and the judge nearly shit his pants on the bench. But I put that whole scenario in. Aaron Klein of World Net Daily essentially agrees with me on this stuff, and that I had reached a consensus with a number of thinkers, including Eric Phelps, and we believe that the Americans are going to be blamed for leveling the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the leveling of Mecca and Medina, and having the new Babylon, which was being built by Saddam Hussein, by the way. He had done a great excavation and archaeological dig, and had proceeded significantly in rebuilding Babylon, and that Mecca and Medina will be replaced by the new temples in the city of Babylon, and that the ecumenical structure of the new Pharisees with the Pope, with the transformed Pope, will be sitting in the third temple, and that's very close to final.
So what you're saying here is that the Pope, the Catholic Church, the Jesuits operating pretty much as a secret service here, have done a lot of this to point blame at the Jews are the Zionists, right?
Well,
Or the Zionists are using to point, or the Zionists are using these things to and hiding behind the average Jewish citizen out there. I mean,
right,
we got a bunch of brainwashed people running around. Some of them think they're Jews, some of them think they're Muslims, some of them think they're Christians, and they've lost the idea that they're humans, aren't they?
Well, look, when that temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. by Titus, it destroyed the religion. It was a final religion. They could no longer practice their religion. They could only have rabbis to speak of the religion rather than practice the religion. The Pharisees practiced the religion in the temple. That was where the religion was active. When they burned the temple, the religion ceased to be active. So that the intent is to rebuild the temple under a compromise that was submitted by Rome, and that the Inquisition by the Roman Pontiffs and by the Pontifex Maximus, the Caesars, has always been to punish anybody who would oppose either the commerce or the commerce being temporal power or the spiritual power of Rome. And that was before the existence of the Catholic Church. Catholic Church didn't exist until in the 300s, when it was co-opted from the Greek name. But that Constantinople and all the rest, that was the seat of Rome, and the two-headed eagle, which you see would be Rothschild. So I consider Rothschild a Catholic. He adopted the Rothschild, the double-headed eagle, red shield, through his association with the Palafatinis, who were part of the Lombardy League out of Venice, whose earlier family member was a pope in the 1200s. And that the Rothschilds are really errand boys for the very old Roman families, and that the Jews, per se, are dependent on the rebuilding of the temple. And now Zionism, per se, is the plan to rebuild the temple. And that there was a man by the name of Shabbat Tzvi who came out of Turkey. I sort of compare him to a dervish in the 1600s who actually went over the edge in the practice of Purim, wife swapping and a lot of other things, Purim, where the men get drunk and get out of order. But in fact, he had a following which ends up through Jacob Frank, who was married to a very colorful woman in the Mideast, and he ends up taking his whole movement as followers of Shabbat Tzvi. This is in the late 1700s to Poland, and he converts his entire flock as Frankists to Catholicism and became the first Zionists. But that's Jacob Frank, and that the strongest and staunchest Zionists are those who have committed themselves to Rome as Jews to rebuild the Third Temple. That's what Zionism is. That's what the Third Reich was. The whole Nazi movement were the Zionist Jews who became Catholics, and Hitler was a Catholic, a staunch Catholic out of Austria, and that they believed that the recreation of Israel must be done in order to rebuild the Third Temple, because it says that the temple could only be rebuilt by Jews. So that any Jew who wanted to maintain themselves in the diaspora in the Mosaic, after they were chased out of Jerusalem by Titus in 70 A.D., any Jew who would refuse to become a Zionist was to be put to death. And that's what the Jewish Nazis, the Catholic Nazis, the Catholic Zionist Nazis were. And that's who Soros is. Now, Soros has funded the Palestinian country, this Palestinian state, as a corporation in which Obama holds stock. This is according to Aaron Klein. And of last year, he did a series of articles on the corporation that was created. The Shalabi movement inside the White House is quite clear that the Palestinians have made a deal that they will practice at the temple when it is rebuilt as part of the one religion, so that Islam, per se, will be put under the caliphate, under one world religion, and there'll be one world commerce and one world religion controlled out of that temple and out of Babylon. So, I mean, that's a pretty grim assessment of things, but I think it's true. And I've come to that only slowly over the last 4 years, but that I would bank on it right now. And certainly Obama he is an investor in the destruction of the nation of Israel, for it being absorbed as merely a principality of the greater caliphate. And the deal is that the reformation of the Pharisees under the plan, which the Jesuits, who were prompted by the death of Thomas More in 1535, who was the head of the Inquisition against the Reformation, and as a matter of fact, his nephew was the first Jesuit provincial of England after his death. And Ignatius Loyola worked with Thomas More's son. Of course, Thomas More was beatified, and the Red Mass is celebrated every year at the order of John Paul II, of all of our judges and attorneys, especially the six Catholics on the Supreme Court. There's absolutely no way we can maintain a constitution, and Roberts is the worst. He is a Catholic zealot who wants the rebuilding of the caliphate, and I'm adamant on the need to expose that there is no separation of any religion at this point from the one world religion, the ecumenical religion. And anybody like the Adventists or the Baptists who had opposed that would be shunned, both in not being invited to the World Council Churches meetings and to other global meetings, and that they would be pushed into a corner. The Jesuits are the head of the Inquisition, and I'm going to put up on my website a very interesting discussion by E. Howard Hunt before he died on the role of the Jesuits being the preeminent world intelligence agency, and he praises them over and over again as to their competence as an intelligence agency. What is not really known is that the Versailles Treaty structure put in place by Wilson's Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, who came out of New York State. It was Robert Lansing who created the first Department of State Security Services centered on the Jesuits, and Edmund Walsh was directly in uniform, a picture of him in uniform, working in the Versailles Treaty negotiations for Robert Lansing, and that the Jesuits were incorporated into our entire foreign service, and Georgetown became the school for foreign service, and there's nothing that we, in our foreign service or policy, that is not in the hands of Jesuits directly, and I mean directly. So that if you look at the history of Robert Lansing, and he was the uncle to the Dulles brothers, John and Allen Dulles, John Foster and Allen Dulles were given their first jobs in the State Department by Robert Lansing under the Wilson administration. John Foster's son, Avery Dulles, became a very high cardinal Jesuit in the Catholic Church, and died recently and was living at Fordham University. But that I see no difference, Clay, between the Catholic Church and Episcopals. And when I hear Zionist, I think of Catholic, and I think specifically back to the master plan in the destruction of the Second Temple by Titus, and by the Caligula family. It was the Piso family, and the elder Piso was put to death by Nero in 64 AD for his attempted assassination and overthrow.
Okay, let me stop you for a minute and ask you about the Masons. Now, I've got some authors and people that I know fairly well, don't particularly want to talk with me. Ralph Epperson is one of those. He talks about the hidden hand, and he doesn't like it because I believe the Jews play a bigger role, possibly, or as big a role as the Masons here. Now, I've asked the question, and I will be asking this in much greater detail in my future books. here, talking about the existence of Lucifer and the role he plays with the Masons. And I've asked myself, now how far back does this conspiracy go, this religious conspiracy? Did they promote Jesus to God? Did they kick him upstairs back in about 240 AD at the Council of Nicaea, because they didn't want men like you and I aspiring to be the kind of man he was, so they deified him to put him beyond our reach? So,
well, this gets into a realm of science, and maybe bigger than what we would be able to produce on one show. But certainly, I believe that Rome knew who was being crucified for 100 years or more in what we now know as the Holy Lands, and certainly the figure Christ may have existed, and certainly Jesus was not a Jew. Jesus is as I say, any Jew who was named Jesus wouldn't get bar mitzvah, because it's not a Jewish name. So, just the fact that the Roman family, Caligula's family, who wrote the story as a polemic against the Pharisees and the Zealots who they ended up fighting, and Masada and all the rest, the Zealots were fighting them, and which ended up in the destruction of the temple. It was the First and Second Jewish War, and that under Hadrian was the Second War. So that the necessity to co-opt the story was done, that the Jesus figure was a fiction. I'm not saying that a person who was crucified at the same time in Jerusalem didn't exist. I don't know. I really don't know. And I believe that the Eastern Church believes that, but that the Western Church, the Roman Church, knows that their Mariology and everything else is all meant to co-opt the Hebrews into joining the ecumenical structure, which would be the rebuilding of the Third Temple. That's my thought. That's where I come in on this, and that I believe that that the story was written and rewritten. Certainly, the first Gospel of Mark and the second Gospel, which was rewritten, it was written by a Roman. It was Josephus in particular was the man who was the name taken by the person who wrote the first Gospel of Mark, and he was a Roman. Okay, he was a Roman and a Jew, so that and he was related to Caligula. He was related directly to Caligula, and that the names have been, that the general who takes down the temple was actually part of that family, and he took on the name, I forgot the general's name, but that was a name, a fictitious name. They would take names pinned to the specific actions that would be remembered in history, written history, so that one name would become many names in order that they would be bigger than just one person, and that would be harder for somebody to trace back that name to the person who actually did it, because they may end up as the Roman emperor. So as a roundabout answer to your question here, I believe that the entire invention of Christianity was done to specifically co-opt the Hebrews, and that the issue of the prior civilizations goes into the science of energy and matter and its relationship to time, as to whether or not you can transform energy into matter equals mc squared. How is that done? Can you flip matter into energy? It goes into the Star Trek stuff as to whether you beam up, go into a buffer, and be kept safe as energy, and then transform as matter again. That's really what Moses discovered when he went into that cave, and he discovered technology from a prior civilization. The Jews did not discover the Hebrew. That was given to them. They weren't smart enough to do the language. It is a computer language. It was part of a master program. That was part of the equipment that Moses found. Now, that's pretty heavy-duty stuff, and I'd be more than happy to come back and discuss that.
Well, I'm sorry but I think you already you already earned a few more days with this, because I've been doing what you're talking about now is hitting on the type of research I've been doing for pretty much 60 years.
Wow. How old are you, man?
I'm 66 as of yesterday.
Okay. So you went to school. You went to Sunday school. You're telling me. Huh?
I'm telling you, before I could read before I went to school. I read every science fiction book in the Fort Worth Public Library before I was 14. I certainly know, am very familiar with Robert A. Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Jules Verne, and Edgar Rice Burroughs, and
right.
I've got a series of novels that are following into the footsteps of John D. MacDonald. John D. MacDonald created a character named Travis McGee, and in John D. MacDonald's first book, Travis McGee slept with a woman by the name of Molly B. and from Texas, and that was my character's mother. So I've got 2 books out of that series. But 45 years ago, I was doing time in a Texas prison for marijuana, and I sat down and wrote some fiction novels about the United States in the future when marijuana was legal. And the character that showed up to legalize marijuana in the future was called Solomon. And I also wrote a story about an advanced race called the Atlanteans, who built a series of ships called Earth ships that were designed to not only be able to go into outer space, but to survive any kind of planetary catastrophe that they knew was coming up. And my character was named Lucifer. He was the co-captain on the Earth ship Heaven with Tetragrammaton Lord, or nickname Yahweh. And as Atlantis sunk, the captain went crazy, and when Lucifer threatened to take over, he was kicked out of the Earth ship Heaven and consigned to the hell that was Earth. And he's been around for about 6,000 years. He comes back in various guises and various identity throughout history. One of those was a character called Jesus in Jerusalem, in that area. And in the future, he comes back as a character named Solomon. Now, that's all science fiction, folks. That's all science fiction. That's just either a product of my vivid imagination or a memory of the last 10,000 years that I just can't get out of my head. How about it, Chris?
Well, it sounds reasonably close to, I think, what really happens. I'm going to send you a book, and which I read, and it really can. You know, I was involved in oceanography. I was a big devotee of Arthur C. Clarke, and I read his book Deep Range about the sea cowboys who were herding whales, and like the cattle on land, they were herding whales. And I thought that was just a great book, and I wanted to become an oceanographer. That's the late 50s, early 60s. I read Emanuel Velikovsky and The World's in Collision, and back in the 50s, and certainly I was well aware that there was earlier cataclysms which had not been discussed in any significant way, which are repeating cycles. Velikovsky being wrong, but he said basically that Venus was a captured comet, and which had come in collision with Mars and close collision with the Earth, and that it had been what swept the atmosphere from Mars and deposited it on the Earth. That's Velikovsky.
Yeah, congratulations. By the way, that Velikovsky, the passing of Mars and Venus are described in what I call the conjunction or the end in the story of Lucifer, which is available on my website. You can actually read the screenplay, and he describes the destruction of Atlantis from the rainfall picked up from Venus, and he described Venus and Mars in the heavens, where it looks like the comets coming down are pulling Mars, the god of war, and he said, they wonder what the natives think about it.
Well, the Bible called it in Genesis. I think it was calling pouring manna from heaven. You know, it came down honey. There's a hydrocarbon structure of glucose, and it was raining from the sky, which is true. I mean, it goes into the whole discussion of manna from heaven and blah blah blah. But I believe that there's a big story, and that we're really on a short 34-year clock, and that the Club of Rome wants to see most of the human race, I'd say 95% of the human race, destroyed, and that it's doing everything it can to do that, the Stewart family in particular. And they're, of course, devotees of Rome and of the Zionist Catholic retaking of what we now know as being designed under the Oslo Accords in Palestine. And that Acre, Acre was Judea at one point until Hadrian renamed it Acre rather than Judea, and when he banned all the Jews. So all this goes back to the 12,000-year cycle. You bring up Atlantis, so if you read the Timaeus and the Critias by Plato, he goes into the whole destruction of the prior Earth, and that the Earth turned in a different direction. In fact, do you believe
that I believe we had technology to anti-gravity? I believe that's the way we built the pyramids. I believe that we had UFOs 10,000 years ago.
I know we have that. We have that now, Clay, and the U.S. government has had it ever since the 60s that I know of. I mean, I knew when I was in the Air Force of holographic warfare. They were projecting images through ionized cloud structures to show. I mean, that's where most of your flying saucers are. It's holographic imaging. And we've been working on that for 50 years that I know of. And that, but what you want to do is get the enemy to shoot at something that the radar says exists but doesn't exist. And you want to be able to move the thing very quickly to scare the enemy and everything else. So that's holography. It's projections. And but we do have anti-gravity. We have anti-gravity equipment.
I have said the reason they keep it from us, the reason that UFO technology is so top secret, because if we knew, as a people, that we could have lunch on the moon today without using a drop of gasoline and be back in time for supper, I would think that
we don't need a ship. All we need is the ability to transform energy into matter and then to transmit it. And we don't need ships.
A Stargate, in other words, and that technology, I have been told, has been around for a long time. So.
Well, that's what Moses found, see. That's what Moses found. He didn't understand it. But he was given the computer code, which ended up as the Torah. The Torah is the computer code, believe it or not. And that it is merely a master, a time sequencing code, like the disk operating system, which ran that equipment. And they invented this Hebrew convoluted language, but the code itself was handed down from the prior civilization to Moses. And that he certainly, although he was the son of the Pharaoh, he was not sharp enough to have done it himself. And although he created the stories of Genesis, and his brother Aaron played a part in that. But,
all right, stay with me for a couple of minutes here. I've got to shut everything down here. Thank you. Chris Strunk has been my guest today. Hang on.
Call recording has been completed.
At truthradio.com. At Truth Radio, you can listen live or listen to a large selection of archived programs on demand. Listen when you want to. truthradio.com.
All right. We got that commercial.